The French kings Louis took their horses and their riding very seriously. Their horses were the finest in the world. Their nobly born horse trainers and instructors the best to be had in Europe. These factors created an intense focus on the subject of high equitation and the process of making an educated, polished, elegant horse and rider. The collective zeal of all the players was such that the timeless traditions of the king's manege of the 18th century came to represent the zenith of horsemanship. Learn about the legendary School of Versailles and the glorious horsemen. Wandering through this lovely pale gold city, up the broad tree-lined Avenue de Paris, toward the Château de Versailles would seduce all but the most hardened traveler to dream of times long past. As the château's magnificent edifice comes into view and its buildings seem to go on, one can't help but remember that, designed and created as it was by the finest thinkers and artists of their time to perpetuate knowledge and beauty, the highest cultural values embodied in European civilization at the time were showcased at the Château de Versailles. If you're a stranger to Versailles, you would probably not realize that we've been walking between the king's two stables, but as we reach the Place d'Armes and turn our backs to the chateau, we will be facing two massive building complexes that today house modern offices. Yet, long ago, these classically timeless, stately buildings of soaring, harmonious proportion and exquisite sculptured ornamentation were constructed by Louis XIV of France to celebrate his passion for elaborate equestrian performances and to stable the finest horses of the world, his own. To the right is the Petite Écurie, and to the left is the Grande Écurie, which also was home to the King's Equestrian Academy that came to be known as the School of Versailles. Here worked his master écuyers and their masterful students, who in time also became master écuyers. In our busy postmodern lives, it may seem of dubious use to study the work and literature of great equestrians long dead. However, at one time the master-student lineage was extremely significant, and nowhere is this factor more important than in the lineages of the equestrian arts. The historical cross-pollination of high-level equitation methodology across Europe is a very complex and fascinating subject, and studying it gives context to our own search for meaning in our modern riding practices. It all started when the French King Louis XIII built a hunting lodge at the edge of the forest northeast of his Paris palace. Without going into too much detail, his son Louis XIV, also known as the Sun King, as a child had witnessed an alarming socio-political uprising of what would become his subjects someday, and after achieving his majority, he had decided to move his court from the distractions of Paris out to Versailles, where he could keep his eye on all his courtiers and keep them under control. As he built out the Château de Versailles, right across the Place d'Armes and facing the chateau, he built his massive stables. We see the great blocks of stone at the building site in the second image, and instituted the School of Versailles. Of all the many species of animals kept at the court of Versailles, horses were the most important to embody the French king's royal magnificence. The large number of horses catered to the needs of varied, intense equestrian activity for the king, the royal family, their courtiers, and visitors. These activities included not just riding for pleasure or travel, but hunting, exercises in the riding school, and performance events carried out on a massive scale. In the stables at Versailles alone you could see what you could not hope to see anywhere else except on long journeys, an admirable and elite collection of horses. The many-colored chargers, which eventually grew to over 2,000 in number, and most of which came from abroad in England, Ireland, Spain, North Africa, and Northern Europe, were chosen with great care, and their beauty and the quality of their dressage amazed visitors. To get an idea of the scope of this training infrastructure and the events enjoyed by the royal court, let us briefly return to Paris for a couple of the historical extravaganzas that occurred before the move of the court to Versailles in 1686. From these, you will understand the need for highly trained, bomb-proof horses. In this stunning painting, we witness a real cacophony of influences. One source says that this event, the carrousel Place de Royale, took place in 1612. Another says it was organized in part to celebrate Louis XIII's wedding with Anne of Austria in 1615. Another source claims that the great equier of the king, Antoine Pluvinel, choreographed the carousel, which might account for the delicate nature of the music composed for it. This carousel comprised a 3-day spectacle of parade, tournament, and carousel. All festivities were devoted to the public joy and included floats pulled by 6 lions, another pulled by 8 deer, another pulled by at least 2 bears, and we can see at least 4 elephants in the mix. Many of the horses are looking askance at the menagerie of strange creatures. Some accept the commotion, but not all are happy to be stationed in front of the cannons or what may or may not be leopards. More than 2,000 men and 1,000 horses faced the spectators and were costumed in silks, satins, pearls and gems, silver and gold embroidery. The bourgeois watched in a vast number from risers and scaffolds. Members of the royalty, nobility, and courtiers appeared at the windows of the Place Royale buildings, with 80,000 members of the public who could not enter the square surrounding it, straining to see the activities through the arched entrances. In 1662, 25-year-old Louis XIV has attained his majority and is now on the throne due to the assassination of his father. He is using the birth of his son, the Dauphin, as an excuse to make a display of magnificence and power, humbly starring as the Sun King in the courtyard of the Tuileries Royal Chateau in Paris, now known as the Place de Carrousel. The performances lasted 2 days and began with a great procession, with 1,297 participants, of which 655 were mounted on horseback, for games of tilting, ring catching, mounted combat, and carousel. The theme for this festivity was a tribute to the 5 most exotic countries of the time. Each group was headed by a member of the court, and each had its own color scheme. Louis XIV headed the Romans as their emperor, and clad in red and black. Even the king's horse was dressed in a caparison covered in diamonds and red and gold tassels. Now, we've returned from our Paris adventures and are back in Versailles with at least 600 horses populating the newly constructed Grande and Petite Écurie, with an overflow stabled in the stables of the royal family and elsewhere in Versailles. In 1685, we will see the first carousel staged in Versailles, undertaken by Monseigneur the Dauphin, the oldest son of King Louis XIV, who takes center stage on his glorious pure white stallion that carries red tack and caparison, crusted in jewels and embroidery of precious metals. Unfortunately, only 2 representations of the carousel can be found to illustrate the grandeur, and none to show any of the choreography. We've seen the kinds of spectacles and events favored by the French court, and we come to the big question. Who's been training the horses for these activities, who face casts of thousands of other horses, under pressure to perform complex carousels correctly, enduring explosions of guns and cannons and loud music, lions, bears, elephants, deer, and what may or may not be leopards? The answer is we look to the great equiers of the king, the best in the world, and their best students.